Hello everyone, let's get ready for the first ever Furry Breadpilled podcast. We're a group of anarchists and we're reading Conquest of Bread. That's what we're doing, and we're furries. So, before we get started, if we want to all introduce ourselves.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll go first. So I'm known far and wide as Feilong Gecko, or just Gecko. I am a United Anarchist, which is kind of my own breed of anarchism that kind of draws a lot from synthesis anarchism. And this is not my first go around with theory, but I feel like it's a good place to get started.
All right. And Cardin, you want to discuss what you introduce yourself and kind of tell you what your ideology is?
Yeah, why the hell not? I'm Cardin Drakerav. Not so widely known depending on who you ask, but this is exactly my second round with theory, with the first one just being the Communist Manifesto and also a life in retail. So that's kind of where I'm at with all that fun stuff.
Yeah, a life in retail is really the best theory you can get. Let's be real.
Honestly, like if you've worked retail, you go left.
All right, so I'll get into my introduction before I give that anecdote. But I'm Kaanfight. You can call me Kaan. I have a YouTube channel. I'm also a member of the Sig Marxism podcast, where we talk about Warhammer and leftist-related stuff. And here we're talking about anarchism and furries. So it's different. And this is the first time me kind of trying to host a podcast, and we're seeing where it goes. So it'll be fun. So without further ado, if we want to get into I believe, Gek, you had a kind of an intro into who is Peter Kropotkin and how is he important to the anarchist school of thought or the anarchist tradition.
Should I take that hit now, or?
So, yeah, just go ahead and smoke whenever you want, man. Who gives a shit?
Just ripping hits right now, just fucking blazing it.
So, I guess the biggest thing about Kropotkin is he was one of the fathers of anarchism. And I call him the father of anarchism mostly because he was the main guy who took anarchism towards the path that it is currently, the scientific route. And he kind of followed Marx in that desire because they were kind of the biggest people that took this, general ideology and made it into a scientific route. Before Kropotkin and even Bakunin to some degree, the most anarchism that you really saw was, Proudhon and Godwin, and both of them kind of just sat down and just theorized a bunch of stuff. Didn't really try to make any scientific claims. But the biggest thing that I found when I was reading this intro into him was that Kropotkin was actually born a Prussian prince. His family, I'm quoting this PDF copy that I have here, specifically edited by Marshall Schatz, basically said that Kropotkin's family traced their ancestry back to the rulers of Solmsk, one of the independent principalities of medieval Russia. So that's where he gets his princely name. And he kind of bounced around, Kropotkin then, between, being personal page of Emperor Alexander II, joining the Russian military towards the beginning of his life, and then after the 1880s he became, after the 1860s he became kind of this anarchist. Quoting the book again, it said, reviewing his Siberian experience in his memoirs, he declared that by the time they ended, I was prepared to become an anarchist. through that, after being kicked out of Russia for various reasons, Kropotkin joined the First International, which actually had Bakunin in it, but unfortunately, the two anarchist writers kind of missed their chance to meet each other. But it wasn't he had been part of the Bakunin arm, but because Bakunin was near the winter of his years, they kind of really didn't have a chance to meet.
It's really nice to think of anarchism. Sorry, it's the first time I've really thought of it in this terms, but anarchism as predating fucking modern punk by centuries.
Yeah, that's even the weird thing. Like, when I was reading the preface to the one copy I had by Kent Bromley, he was talking about kind of a lot of older writers who are in the socialist tradition, and usually, like, you think of, like, Marx start socialism and that's it, but there was more writers beforehand that were also doing things, and I thought that was very cool.
Yeah, that was a really fun. I've seen a lot of facts that are not fun. This was a fact that was fun.
Well, and it's also really cool to find out that, anarchy had always existed to kind of some degree, even back before a lot of the neoliberalist and the conservative movements. I mean, I guess less conservatism, because conservatism kind of started back pre-French Revolution, because it was trying to conserve the monarchies, but yeah.
Yeah, I there's this whole idea of, like, you have the anarchist tradition that goes back to Kropotkin, Bakunin, and a little bit before that, like we said, with a couple of the other guys that kind of started this whole idea of socialism that kind of grew out of the Enlightenment, really. And then you have some people would say anarchism even goes back even further to basically the start of civilization. Some people would consider that to be, true anarchism, which is kind of where the idea of, like, anarcho-primitivism comes from.
I can see that. As long as there's been room for a bad king to come about, there's an origin for anarchism.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Like, it only takes the one to get the ball rolling.
Well, and I think with Proudhon, Bakunin, and Kropotkin specifically, anarchism grew into less of a specifically anti-state thing, and more of a social theory in how people can survive without, Hobbes' Leviathan. This idea that we have to give our rights up to a larger system just to protect our property. And I think with Bakunin sitting down and going, hey, let's look at this scientifically through social theory, through economic theory, and how we can actually sit down and create this new system that he called anarchist-communism without having to have this great force that's going to sit there and dictate our lives.
Also, the word communism is loaded AF today. And it's like, just remember, there was a time before that. It hasn't always been a naughty word.
Well, that's the thing, is that the context of communism today really stems back to the Soviet Union and McCarthyism in general. Or even before then, like, I've seen people make the argument that, historically speaking, the Cold War really started after the Russian Revolution, just because of how the first Red Scare really solidified anti-communist propaganda in American society, which was suspended mostly during World War II, but really came back in force afterwards during what we consider usually the Cold War. But this idea of communism as totalitarian and authoritarian and dictatorial is really what people get hung up on in the modern context, mostly due to propaganda. And mostly due to people being disingenuous about really the origins of it, or no one actually reading the theory, they're only hearing that communism was bad because the Soviet Union existed.
Well, I would also like to point out that, like, the traditional the traditional definition of the term communism as espoused by Marx, and I wouldn't necessarily call myself a communist or even a Marxist to be specific, but to be very pedantic about it, the term communism was specifically a socialism, i.e. the worker-owned workplaces that was moneyless, classless, and stateless. So in the beginning, communism, this ideal, was an anarchist idea.
Exactly, because anarchist is it's the antithesis of the state. I think also one of the biggest things that people get hung up with about anarchism is just the idea of not having a state, and then people being like the colloquial like idea that automatically without a state, like the purge is going to happen, and there's no laws, and there's no humans are inherently evil, and they will just riot if there's no laws, or like if there's
Honestly, if somebody says that, then that says a lot about that somebody.
Exactly.
It's like, what the fuck are you gonna do if there's no one to stop you?
Well, it's the same.
Damn.
It's the same thing where it's like if no one sees you commit something, are you still gonna if a cop's not around and I just straight up like shoot? Does that mean I can just straight up shoot someone and no one's around?
I was just like, why is that the first thing that comes to your mind there? Come on now.
Yeah, it's kind of like the people who are like, "Oh, you're a feminist, so I can punch you in the face." Huh? You want me to punch you in the face? Like, really, dude? Like, no, that's not what the theory is. But do you really want to just go around punching people in the face? Do you really want to go around just murdering people?
Yeah, but we all know that anarchists are the ones that punch Nazis, so therefore they're the bad guys.
Oh yeah, anarchists are totally the violent ones.
Oh wait, no, I mostly get my memes from anarchist circles, so of course they paint them the heroes.
So to kind of start off with this, just to kind of shift the thing to kind of go into what this idea of anarchism is, this Kropotkian version of anarchism.
Is Kropotkian a word yet? If not, it should be.
It probably is.
Well, let's make it.
We're making history, folks. We made Kropotkian a word.
Yes.
So the biggest thing that I want to start off with was this idea of what went on to the preface of my copy. It basically goes, one of the current objections of communism and socialism altogether is that the idea is so old yet has never been realized. Schemes of ideal states haunted the thinkers of ancient Greece. Later on, the early Christians joined in communist groups.
Yeah.
Centuries later, large communist brotherhoods came into existence during the Reform movement. Then the same ideals were revived during the Great English and French Revolutions, and finally, lately, in 1848, a revolution inspired to a great extent with socialist ideals took place in France. And yet, you see, we are told, how far away is still the realization of your schemes? Don't you think that there is some fundamental error in your understanding of human nature and its needs? Oh boy!
Yeah, that was that was the same one in mine. The preface about that was by Kent Bromley, I believe, in 1906, October 1906.
Well, so here's the biggest thing that I want to point out is that even back in 1906, we had this objection to socialism and communism that, well, what about human nature? This idea of, well, humans are obviously super greedy, so we can't have this system without a state.
Yeah, and it's sad to admit it, a valid point. Sam has pointed out, Sam being my wonderful boyfriend, that the honor system is only good right up until someone decides to abuse it, and then everyone else wonders why they can't abuse it the same way.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny how you discussed, human nature, and this is when we were talking in the pre-podcast. Kropotkin actually discussed this in his book that came out after the Conquest of Bread in Mutual Aid, on how human nature actually doesn't really necessarily exist, and even evolution favors species that can work together.
Yeah, he talks about it a little bit. It's almost like a common. I find it interesting because that was a common trope where it's like, it's this idea of, well, even if it is human nature, even if that is the naturalist argument, just because it's human nature does not mean it is necessarily a good thing. And just because people can overcome their nature, that is...
If evolution is real, then how come there are still monkeys? Checkmate, commune atheists.
Jesus fucking Christ. Now we have Kent Hovind on the pod now. Kill myself.
Who?
Kent Hovind is a creationist. He's kind of like, I don't know if you know who Ken Ham is.
Yeah, okay.
He's along that line. coincidentally also went to jail for mail fraud, but that's a whole nother story.
I mean, I kind of avoided, looking too far into that whole atheist versus theist debate, and especially the creationists, just because it's like, this doesn't affect my life too much, and it's a lot of bad energy. See, I'm putting energy into this because this shit does affect my life.
Yeah.
And people I care about.
It was probably smart of you to do that just because it just rots your brain eventually because the arguments get so dumb and just so, like, pedantic that it just doesn't really matter at the end. It's just like, it doesn't matter.
The last time I kept up with these circles, it was by watching Thunderfoot.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. Nah.
Yeah, so, anyways, we were talking a little bit about, so he goes on in the preface to kind of talk about some of the things against communism and kind of talk about the occurrences since Kropotkin. Since I believe Kropotkin, is Conquest of Bread was written, when was it written? I'm trying to remember. Let me look this up. We can cut this out of the font. Ken Bromley is kind of talking about what happens afterwards with and kind of the context in which Conquest of Bread is written. He talks a lot about the thinkers of socialism beforehand, which is like Fabian socialism, and kind of how Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars changed things after the French Revolution. And he's talking about all of that, and then he also talks about the Revolution of 1848 in France. A lot of this is actually centered around Paris, and Kropotkin takes a long time to talk about Paris in what he's doing. So that's an interesting topic to discuss.
Yeah, on initial reading actually gave me the sense that he either predated or was contemporary to Marx, and in particular, the writing of the Communist Manifesto.
He was a little bit around that time. If I recall, he was a little bit later. Marx was like writing in the 1830s and died in 1860s. So Kropotkin was a little bit later because he was born 1840s and died somewhere in the 1900s, if I recall correctly.
Well, and it's also good to note that when Bakunin started becoming an anarchist, the Marx wing of the First International had already been in existence for at least a decade or two. So.
Yeah, and Bakunin did not like Marx.
Oh no, he called them, and I'm actually quoting the book here. He called them the German state socialists.
Yeah, he did not like them, and he had I think he eventually tried to link Marx to the Rothschilds, which actually Kropotkin does talk about in here, which is interesting, but he doesn't. And the problem with like the Rothschilds, the modern context, is that it's so caught up in conspiracy theories and like Illuminati stuff rather than like actual, the Rothschilds in reality were just someone who got super rich off of gaming the system and then just kept that wealth. And we'll discuss that here in a little bit. But anyway, so going on to chapter 1 is our riches. And we're talking about kind of, he starts it off by just basically talking about how far we've gone from the beginning of human civilization up till the 19th century, and kind of how much we've produced and how much things have been mechanized, the Industrial Revolution and things of that nature, and doing all things with that. And then he's like, all right, so if we have all these riches and we have all this stuff, then why are there poor people? And that's what he really tries to get into and explain. That's what anarchism, I think, at its whole is trying to explain. Why, if we have an abundance of wealth, why is it centered in only certain people? Which is very true, especially in today's day and age with the rise of neoliberalism and just global capitalism as opposed to simply state capitalism and more or less doing capitalism on using the world scale as capitalism without borders is essentially what it is, as opposed to trading between countries, which is what capitalism back in the 19th century was for the most part, besides of some of the colonial conquests of different territories, but that was colonialism. So it's the idea of like neo-colonialism where it's you still strip the resources of the place that you are colonizing However, you do not actually invade them or conquer them specifically. So that's kind of how colonialism has moved on to the modern day. And he's talking about, and a lot of the things that he talks about with why there poor people are very relevant to today. So if we want to talk a little bit about that, where he's saying,
I mean, some people, then a lot of capitalists probably should read some of Kropotkin, because he straight up explains why there's poor people. And, you know, I know some capitalists. I know an ANCAP, I think we all know, who literally had the attitude of, if if this was your concern, why do you choose to be a peasant?
Well, this was the thing. It's the idea of the capitalist idea is you choose to be poor. You're not, if you're born poor and you can't make it in the system, that is your fault rather than a systemic issue. And the anarchist perspective is the reason why people are rich is because they're exploiting the poor. There is always going to be, if there is rich people, there is always poor people. And
that's the thing. Like, as an anarchist, we are going to first fight the boss, then we're gonna fight the government.
That's the thing, yeah. Where it's like, I mean, the state as a whole is really the thing that keeps all the status quo together, because that's what the state does. It's the whole idea of maintaining capitalism and maintaining private property. Those are the two things the state does. And so it wants to maintain the status quo, it wants to keep everything the same, and then just tell you that the system is good and you should just shut up about all your grievances because how we're doing it is just fine and just peachy. And so...
But it ain't.
Exactly. That's where people get this false sense of complacency. To put some context behind that earlier remark, we actually kind of formed this podcast after we were in a Telegram group with a bunch of other kind of furries and, people. And I think when...
Was he really a furry?
He claims that he's been chased out of the furry fandom because of so much socialism or something like that.
Did I bully him out of the furry fandom?
You weren't.
No,
it was. You weren't even that mean to him. Like there was like.
I wasn't that mean to him.
No, like compared to some of the things that
Well, compared to some of the things that he said, like, all right, so before we get into that talk, so basically there was a gentleman by the name of Rasa, who was an ANCAP, who could not get past the idea that people were poor not because of their laziness, but because of their own devices. That was something that he could not understand, and just because he said, well, I worked my way up from being poor, therefore anyone can do it.
Despite making literally all of his money off of luck through Bitcoin.
Exactly. He got lucky. That's the thing. A lot of capitalists say that they did it through skill and hard work and pulling up their bootstraps, but the problem is that they're taking only, if we look at it from a scientific perspective, they're taking a biased sample group and then extrapolating that out to the population. We don't know how many people start businesses and they fail miserably and then they're destitute and then they die. That's not taken into account. It's only, I made it so you can make it too, which is kind of true, but it's a lot of luck and it's a lot of just random chance. There's not...
You gotta roll a lot of 20s.
Exactly. You got to be born in the right place. You got to do the right things. And you kind of also have to be very cutthroat about it, because if you're not, then you're not going to make it in capitalism. That's the thing.
Well, and Kropotkin even goes over this. Like, he doesn't directly point to, he doesn't directly point to the capitalists and say, oh, it's your fault. I mean, in a roundabout way, he kind of does. But, he even says millions of human beings have labored to create the civilization in which we pride ourselves today. Other millions, scattered throughout the globe, labored to maintain it. Without them, nothing would be left in 50 years. Nothing would be left in 50 years but ruin.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just making sure. We did get through the whole explanation of who the fuck Rasa is?
I think we did. If we didn't, Rasa is a Bitcoin miner and quote unquote business connoisseur who does not. I mean, he always keeps... he has this idea that basically Bitcoin will lead to Anarcho-communism and the dissolution of the state for the keeping of capital, which makes no sense because you can't have capitalism without a state. Basically, what he's arguing for is not anarchy and statelessness. He's arguing for states in corporate statehood over like corporate personhood is what he's really arguing for. He wants to have corporations be able to make their own state and be able to enforce their own property.
Well, in fear of making this in fear of making this too much about a singular strawman that is Rasa. And I'm not calling the argument, like, we're not making a strawman, like, he literally makes these arguments. Like, he is...
no, this guy is, like, if you wanted to make a strawman argument against, an ANCAP, you would compare them to Rasa.
Yeah, furry ANCAPs are, some of the worst people. Like, you have, what was it? Esoteric Entity, and then, Filthy Heretic also. Like, those are some of the big two on YouTube, and even then they're pretty small, and they like to really...
Goth Skunk, don't forget about that asshole.
Yeah, there's a couple out there that have really... And this sort of this... One of the things you have to get off the table is explaining ANCAP...
That one shark.
Anarcho-capitalism is not in the same vein as something like anarcho-syndicalism or anarcho-communism. And anarchism in general, and that whole theory, like people like Kropotkin, fundamentally disagree with someone like ANCAP. ANCAP uses mostly the colloquial definition of anarchy, where there's just no government, no regulations, really a sort of a hyper-libertarianism is really the best way to describe it. And
it's the atheoretical version of anarchism.
Exactly. It's almost like the... Exactly. And so, but what it really is in ANCAP, in their ideology, there's still capitalism. And, of course, since capitalism cannot exist without a state, well, how do you still have capitalism? Because you have to realize that markets are not the same as a state, markets are not the same as capitalism. And that is a fundamental difference. That markets...
Yeah, it's like, we're going to be back to the barter system, and that is most definitely not capitalism.
Exactly. It's
because there's mutual trust involved, and it's actually voluntary participation.
Exactly. It's not
unlike capitalism.
Markets have existed long before capitalism. Markets have existed long before mercantilism, which was like proto-capitalism a little in a sense, but it was different. And mercantilism died off, but markets still go on, and capitalism will hopefully die off and markets will still go on. It's the same idea. People get so hung up on this idea that without capitalism there would be no markets or there would be no trade, and that's just incorrect. And this ANCAP ideology takes that and basically says, well, how are we going to support private property and have all this stuff in an anarchist system? You make a state out of corporations. You have corporations. Whoever has the most money gets to decide who the most state is. Really, what it is, it's mask off.
It's like the cyberpunk future. Sure, we've got robot parts, but Statey is also the boss.
We cry shame on the feudal baron who forbade the peasant to turn a clod of earth unless he surrendered his lord a fourth of his crop. We called those barbarous times. But if the forms have changed, the relations have remained the same, and the worker is forced, under the name of free contract, to accept feudal obligations. For turn where he will, he can find no better conditions. Everything has become private property, and he must accept or die of hunger.
Exactly, and this is what someone like Rosso could not understand when we tried to tell him. That there's this idea of coerced, even though if you want to have a system based off of consent and mutual consent, coerced consent exists. And under the current system, especially if you have money, or if, like, Kropotkin really goes into this, I think, more in Chapter 3, which we'll get to, but this whole idea of, under our system, because people's wealth is going straight to the top, they are coerced to work for less because they have to survive, because they need food, they need water, and they need to feed their family, they want to, or they even, basically, they need to have basic human functions and rights, and they want to be able to live. So that is where it comes from.
I should say, it's like this runs into a little bit of like ideology or personal ideology, but like in any situation, coerced consent is most definitely not coerced, or is not consent.
It's 100% not consent, because you can... coerced consent, really, like in a sexual tense, is rape. You would say that almost 10 times out of 10. Like, it's the idea of, well, why is incest bad? Well, incest is bad because if you grow up with someone and you have that relationship and then you have sex, there's still that coerce because you have someone who is older than someone else still trying to, or like has some influence over someone else trying to have a sexual relationship. That's why there's a difference between incest, where it's like, oh, my brother and my sister, me and my wife are both adopted, and then we have sex. Oh, wait, we find out we're related. Uh-oh. That really is not as bad as something like, say, we grew up together and then we had sex, because that is more of coerced consent versus just having a consensual relationship and then finding out that you're genetically related. That's very different.
Manufacturing consent by Chomsky, anyone?
Yeah, exactly. So to kind of wrap up this chapter 1, he talks about all for all. That is his main thing, where he kind of goes against he has an interesting thing where he goes against the idea that a man for his labor. He says, no, that's not enough. What we need is all for all. Everyone should have everything. We should all have the fruits of all of our labors.
Yeah, and the exact quote is, all things for all. Here is the immense stock of tools and implements. Here are all these iron slaves, which we call machines, which saw and plane, spin and weave for us, unmaking and remaking, working up raw matter, produce the marvels of our time. But nobody has the right to seize a single one of these machines and say, this is mine. If you want to use it, you must pay me a tax on each of your products. Any more than the feudal lord of medieval times had the right to say to the peasant, this hill, this meadow belong to me. You must pay me a tax on every sheaf of corn you reap, on every rick you build. All is for all. If the man and woman bear their fair share of work, they have the right to their fair share of all that is produced by all, and that share is enough to secure them well-being. No more of such vague formulae as the right to work, or to each the whole result of his labor. What we proclaim is the right to well-being for all.
That's what I find hilarious, is like, even in this wording, with the current hegemony that we have of neoliberalism, the right to work and having right to work states, it's very draconian that they're using that same terminology that still, it hasn't changed since 150 years ago. That's what I find so crazy about that quote, and when I first read it, I was like, whoa.
Yeah, that kind of messed me up a little bit. I had to redo that one a few times.
Oh, yeah. It's a very hard concept to come to, but the basic idea is, it reminds me of an argument I was having with my family about kind of socialism, and the idea of, well, ideas are valuable, and ideas, the reason why socialism will never work is because you just don't value ideas enough. And I think our thing is the idea that usually when you have an idea, it is going to be based off of your other people's ideas.
Well, it's branching into the literary theory that, there is no such thing as originality. Like, even our modern stories are based off of the hero's journey, which was invented back in the 2000s BC, and even prior to that. It's just, we're telling the same story over and over again, but with more and more nuance.
Everything is a remix.
Yeah, basically.
And so, therefore, since no one really has an original idea, you can't really have ownership over an idea. So therefore, why not say, we all worked as a collective for this idea, and as a collective for this work, so we should all get to share in the profits. And that's fair. And he actually goes into this in chapter 2, well-being for all. Well-being for all is not a dream. It is possible, realizable, owing to all that our ancestors have done to increase our powers of production. We know indeed that the producers, although they constitute hardly 1/3 of the inhabitants of civilized countries, even now produce such quantities of goods that a certain degree of comfort could be brought to every hearth. We know further that if all those who squander today the fruits of others' toil were first to employ their leisure in useful work, our wealth would increase in proportion to the number of producers, and more. Finally, we know that, the contrary to the theory enunciated by Malthus,
that oracle of middle class and economics, that productive powers of the human race increase at a much more rapid ratio than its powers of reproduction.
Yeah, and then he goes on to own Malthus, because Malthus is just the dunking board which everyone hates because he's a dumbass.
Well, because his entire idea was basically what Swift argued for, but not ironically.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, he basically sat down and was like, you know what would be really good? Because we have all of these poor people, let's just kill them. Just kill them. No more problems. And that was something that Swift was like, hey, yeah. It was like, Swift, the father of satire, sat down and was like, yeah, let's do this as a joke. And Malthus was like, yeah, that's actually a good idea. Like, what the heck?
Well, Malthus really reminds me of this idea of extrapolating things out based on the current data and not really taking into effect that data can change. Like, it's like the thing where people were talking about, there was a study done.
It's like treating the human nature as a constant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There was a study done in the 90s that looked at female marathon runners, and then they extrapolated it out because they were getting faster and faster and faster and faster, and they're like, oh man, soon they'll surpass the male marathoners, and they'll go even more. But their issue with that is, like, if you take that model they were using and extrapolate it out, like, eventually they would be running, like, faster than the speed of light by, like, the 2020s or something stupid like that. It was starting to get, like, really, like, they would just go extremely fast. What ended up happening is that the female marathon runners ended up plateauing around the same time as the male marathon runners, because there's only in the physiological context of today, there's only really a certain time you can really run a marathon, and that's really what ended up happening. Is people didn't expect that. They were just like, oh, it's going to keep going up, and the reason why it was going up was because women weren't able to really use running as a career up until really 70s, 80s, 90s, and the gender revolution.
And this is another point. Like, it actually even ties into another theory called the decline of the rate of profit. And this is a paper that was basically talking about how liberals and capitalists constantly try to look towards this ever increasing rate of profit, thinking that profit's ultimately infinite. But we're seeing now in late stage capitalism that there's only so much profit you could squeeze out of the working class before everything starts to break down.
Yeah, it's like money is not inexhaustible, and you need to put fuel back into the car. You can't just drive it forever.
Well, this is why someone like Fukuyama, with The End of History, why he is basically the Malthus of our time, by saying, we are at the end of history, this ideology is superior, and nothing's gonna change. We are stagnant. We have already won. We're at the end of ideology. And he was completely fucking wrong, because he could not understand that, like, he fell flat on his face after 2001 and 9/11, and also 2008, especially during 2008 and the financial crash, because we realized that neoliberalism is just a boom and bust cycle. Once you have all this profit, it has to go down.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually one of my critiques of Kropotkin. And ironically, like, even Rasa brought this up when he started reading the book, that a lot of these idealists are sitting here and extrapolating based off current projections, which is fair, because like even Kropotkin had said thousands of weavers are forbidden to work the looms, although the wives and children go in rags, and although 3/4 of the population of Europe have no clothing worthy of the name, hundreds of blast furnace, thousands of factories periodically stand idle. Others only work half-time, and in every civilized nation there is a permanent population of 2 million individuals who ask only for work, but to whom work is denied.
I mean, that does happen, though, because you think about, how a lot of places are doing everything they can to make sure that their workers stay part-time only.
Well, but he's more talking about how, going back to the previous quote, how, if everybody just produced, then all would be good, but this is... You can't have everybody producing all the time, because there comes a point where everybody's needs are produced, and this is kind of like a positive for a command economy, in that if you only produce exactly what is needed, then not everybody needs to work all the time, and this kind of branches into post-work theory that we don't really want to get into here.
A system wherein the people own the means of production. Automation would lead to more vacation time as opposed to mass layoffs.
Yeah, and that's kind of branching into post-work theory, which I don't think we want to get into in the very first podcast, because that's some very deep theory stuff.
We could talk about our Lord and Savior Andrew Yang at a later date.
But like, I think Kropotkin was trying to dance around this idea that the issue that he's seeing, especially with the capitalism of his day, is not that people aren't producing, but that people aren't allowed to produce the things that they need. They're not able to sit down and be like, hey, there's this loom that's not being used. I need clothes. Why can't I go make clothes by myself? And it's because this capitalist is sitting down saying, no, that's my loom. Either pay me for the time, money that you don't have because I'm not going to pay you to use it, or, go buy your own loom.
I'm just reminded of the situation. Please spend. No wage, only spend deal.
But that's kind of getting back to the idea of specialization and whether or not specialization is a good thing. Where it's like, if you only work for what you need, that's great. But if you want to specialize in something and then use that labor to try to get other goods and services for other people that are specialized in it, is that a good thing? Or does that lead to people monopolizing the means of production? That's a really big question. And I don't think that specialization is necessarily a bad thing. I think the problem is, like, for me, I'm more of a dem soc in this respect. I believe that there should be some markets involved in a system, but you can not have markets when it involves things like human life, like in healthcare, like in shelter, food, water. You should not commodify those things, because that is just going to lead to basically people being blackmailed to work. So if you have people getting all the things that they need and then producing whatever commodities they want, or consuming whatever commodities are produced, I think that makes for a good system. That's a little bit less anarchist than I think some of the other people in this group, but that's just my idea.
I dig it.
Well, it's not necessarily not anarchist, but it is a decent point to bring up that we do have this increased commodification, and I don't think Kropotkin actually mentions this in the section of the book that we're reading. He might mention it later, but he's pretty much arguing on the further side of, well, let's just make everybody be able to use everything all the time, that he calls expropriation. He says, if plenty for all is to become a reality, this immense capital, cities, houses, pastures, arable lands, factories, highways, education, must cease to be regarded as private property, for the monopolist to dispose of at his pleasure. This rich endowment, painfully won, builded, fashioned, or invented by our ancestors, must become common property, so that the collective interest of men may gain from it the greatest good for all. There must be expropriation, the well-being of all, the end, and expropriation, the means. Expropriation, such then, is the problem which history has put before the men of the 20th century, the return to communism, and all that ministers to the well-being of man.
So basically what he's talking about, he's really anti the enclosure movement and that sort of thing, the idea of the commons, and that's something that can be communally owned. And even like nowadays, we've seen really, I remember in 2012 during the Gezi protests in Turkey, that was one of the biggest things, that the idea of what Erdogan was trying to do there was turn a park into a shopping mall. And that's kind of what the neoliberalism is, where it's taking public land that is used for the public good and is there and turning it into private land for product. And that's really what he's going against.
And this theme really actually started with Proudhon, which is why he is considered the grandfather of the anarchist movement, because he took this idea of, well, the enclosure acts are the bad thing. This is what is causing this issue that we're seeing today, at least in his time. This creation of private property, this taking of the communal ownership of things. And people always I've always seen arguments especially against this of, oh, well, what about the tragedy of the commons, where, people just keep using the commons and using it and using it until it's all used up. And it kind of ignores the fact that a lot of these people had existed on common land for centuries, and this had never really happened. Like, as far as I'm aware, and I will, if anybody can find evidence to this, as far as I will, sit down and talk about it. As far as I'm aware, there is no actual evidence of the tragedy of the commons actually happening in non-stated societies. It's only when we have this Enclosure Act that this starts happening, because the commons starts becoming smaller and smaller and smaller.
And then you get back into tribalism.
Yeah.
Well, so Kropotkin continues about this expropriation, and this is where we start seeing the revolutionary side of Kropotkin. He actually says that, this problem cannot be solved by means of legislation. No one imagines that. The poor, as well as the rich, understand that neither the existing government nor any which might arise out of possible political changes which would be capable of finding such a solution. Whence will the revolution come? How will it announce its coming? No one can answer these questions. The future is hidden. But those who watch and think do not misinterpret the signs. Workers and explorers, revolutions and conservatives, thinkers and men of action will feel that a revolution is at our doors. And this kind of echoes Marx in his whole idea of dialectical materialism.
Yeah.
In the struggle of the class struggle, right?
Honestly,
the worker versus the capitalist.
I took that for granted that there was some revolution in there, because I don't know. I just kind of assumed that. I associated anarchism with fuck shit up, so it was like, if there was an anarchist back then, it was probably fuck shit up.
Well, and even Kropotkin has talked about this. We have all been bent on the studying the dramatic side of revolution so much, and the practical work of revolution so little, that we are apt to see only the stage effects, so to speak, of these great movements. The fight of the first days, the barricades, but this first skirmish is soon ended, and it is only after the breakdown of the old system that the real work of revolution can be said to begin. And I like to think that in this specific phrase, he's not talking about, oh, well, we can't be violent, or he's not even talking about, oh, well, we have to be violent revolutionaries. He's talking about how people focus so much, especially modern anarchists, or at least atheoretical anarchists. They talk so much about what to do during the revolution. We forget what to do after the revolution. And that's, as far as I'm aware, that's the entire endeavor that the Conquest of Bread is going on. And he doesn't really start talking about what actually happens after the revolution until chapter 3, but he's constantly hinting at this. Well, we need to revolt. We need to do this because what the system that we currently have isn't working, and we can't just legislate it away.
He almost skips over the revolution because he kind of talks about the pre-revolution of, well, how did we get to this point and how do we get to this time? And then in chapter 3, as we'll probably go on to here in just one moment, he goes even further and then says, this is what we do after the revolution. He almost skips over it. He's like, what happens during the revolution almost doesn't matter. It's what happens, why we need to have it, and what we can't do to have a revolution, and how revolutions fail.
And maybe for fuck's sake, do not do an impersonation of the state.
Yeah.
He actually, later, before the end of the chapter, he actually even says, all this may please those who like the stage, but it is not revolution. Nothing has been accomplished as yet. And he's even talking about, even during the revolution, even after the rulers and these expropriators are tossed, violently, non-violently, what have you, in this revolution out of their stays, that is not what we're focusing on. We're not, because if we focus so much on the revolution, meanwhile, the people suffer. The factories are idle, the workshops closed, trade is at a standstill. The worker does not even earn the meager wage which was his before. Food goes up in price. With that heroic devotion which has always characterized them, and which in great cities reaches the sublime, the people will wait patiently. We place these 3 months of want at the service of the Republic, they said in 1848, during the Second French Revolution, while the representatives and the gentlemen of the new government, down to the meanest jack in office, receive their salary regularly. The people suffer. With the childlike faith and the good humor of the masses who believe in their leaders, they think that yonder, in the House, in the Town Hall, in the Committee of Public Safety, the welfare is being considered. But yonder, they are discussing everything under the sun except the welfare of the people.
That's kind of what I find funny about that is it's almost like Kropotkin's taking a dig at Castro from beyond the veils of time, because that, like Castro's idea of revolutionary theater and really playing up the revolution itself, at the expense really of sometimes of the Cuban people, and kind of not really he was really doing a lot of revolutionary theater rather than a lot of actual revolution, and then afterwards he kind of became more of an authoritarian and really rooted out the anarchist elements within his own party that had really helped too, because the Cuban Revolution was very, very anarchist, but they were really weeded out afterwards by more of the tanky communists and that sort of thing, leftist infighting. And we saw this again in the Spanish Civil War, earlier in the Spanish Civil War.
And this is actually a good point to discuss how, anarchy, or at least revolution, if you to achieve revolution through violent means, you will always have violence that perpetuates itself after the revolution is over. Because whoever is leading it, whoever the people rally around during the violent revolution, they will look to that person after the revolution to be like, hey, so what do we do now? And that person will often try to hold on to that power. And as much as I try to stand for Cuba, we still see that a lot of the early Cuban movement, at least in terms of post-revolution building of the society, we see a lot of this very violent authoritarian regime. Like, we see that we had a lot of LGBT people locked up. We had a lot of, anarchists locked up. We had a lot of people who were just, kind of minimally critical of the state locked up, all because we're seeing that this violent social revolution is trying to maintain its power.
It's almost like the state and the consolidation of power.
Yes.
And that sort of thing.
Let's just wrap up with the third part of chapter 2, and discuss our end thoughts of the intro into what is anarcho-communism, and we'll end up next chapter going into what happens after the revolution.
All right, sounds good.
All right, let's rock.
Well, as we see that Kropotkin is talking about, we can't just look towards the state to legislate away, and we can't necessarily just sit there and idolize the revolution itself. We have to look forward towards, what to do after the revolution. And he even says, it seems that to us there's only one answer to this question. The question being, how is a way out of these difficulties to be found? He says, we must recognize and loudly proclaim that everyone, whatever his grade in the old society, whether strong or weak, capable or incapable, has, before everything, the right to live. And that society is bound to share amongst all, without exception, the means of existence it has at his disposal. We must acknowledge this and proclaim it aloud and act upon it. And this right here actually sets the stage for what he's going to be talking about in later chapters, specifically his idea of anarcho-communism.
Yeah, the next chapter is just anarchist communism. So that's kind of, he's setting the stage for what he believes communism to be, and what he believes anarchism and communism can go hand in hand. He makes that very clear in chapter 3. But
he straight up implied that anarchism leads to communism, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Like they don't just go together. They are almost inherently the same.
Oh yeah, in chapter 3 he says that explicitly. It's not even implicitly, it's just explicit. This idea almost goes back to the idea of like social justice, and this is almost proto-social justice, where it's the idea of everyone has a right to life, everyone has a right to their whatever is needed to live, and everyone...
Are you telling me social justice is older than I assumed?
Yeah,
it's
pretty much.
Pretty much. I mean, this is like the label is about as old as you think it is, and modern day, the idea of the SJW and the social justice warrior is really a caricature of the social justice movement in general, and generally more rabid people. It's more like neoliberal social justice, which really is
I mean,
not...
shit, I don't mind being a social justice warrior. Call me social justice war machine. Shit.
And I think one of the biggest things, and to kind of wrap up the end of the chapter, is that Kropotkin actually makes this distinction between things like the right to work, the right to live, and the right to well-being. He says very different would be the result if workers claimed the right to well-being. In claiming that right, they claim the right to take possession of the wealth of the community, to take houses to dwell in according to the needs of each family, to socialize the stores of food and learn the meaning of plenty, after having known famine too well. They proclaim the right to all social wealth, fruit of the labor and of past and present generations, and learn by its means to enjoy those higher pleasures of art and science, which have too long been monopolized by the rich. And while asserting their right to live in comfort, they assert what is still more important, their right to decide for themselves what this comfort shall be, what must be produced to ensure it, and what discarded as no longer of value. The right to well-being means the possibility of living like human beings, and of bringing up children to be members of the society better than ours, whilst the right to work only means the right to always be a wage slave, a drudge, rolled over and exploited by the middle class of the future. The right to well-being is the social revolution. The right to work means nothing but the treadmill of commercialism. It is high time for the worker to assert his right to the common inheritance, and to enter into possession of it.
So what we're saying here is that Kropotkin is actually a NEET, and he's saying, don't be a wage slave.
Oh my god. Why would you say that, though?
Well, I had to make the point because, like, wage slave, like, nowadays is, like, with, like, basement dweller, like, alt-right people. And, like, it's just funny to think about, like, Kropotkin back in the day just being a NEET, just being like, oh, man, why are you going to work why are you being such a cuck and going to work, you see? You're a wage slave. You're a wage cuck, obviously.
Well, and I think it's actually a good thing to note that, you know, a lot of socialist theorizers and even Kropotkin came from a lot of these more well-off societies, and he even mentions that back, and to kind of do a callback, he even mentions this back in chapter 2. Where chapter 1, education still remains the privilege of a small minority. For it is idle talk of education when the workman's child is forced, at the age of 13, to go down into the mine, or to help his father on the farm. It is idle to talk of studying to the worker, who comes home in the evening, wearied by excessive toil and its brutalizing atmosphere. Society is thus bound to remain divided into two hostile camps, and in such conditions, freedom is a vain word. The radical begins by demanding a greater extension of political rights, and he soon sees that the breath of liberty leads to the uplifting of the proletariat, and then he turns round, changes his opinions, and reverts to the repressive legislation of government by the sword. And this is actually, it's kind of right to call Kropotkin a NEET, because even though he did work for the crown, and even though he was part of, you know, the military force, he was still really well off compared to most of the workforce of that day.
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole idea. It's almost like the comic idea of socialism, where it's like, oh man, you just live in your mother's basement and you want free money. That idea, as opposed to what socialism actually is. And I think that it's a common misconception, and especially in this day and age, with automation and again, like we said, we're not going into the idea of UBI and stuff in this pod, but it's that whole context.
I do think at a later date we do need to go over post-work theory, because that is very pivotal to modern socialist theory, mostly because it discusses automation and what to do in the face of automation when labor isn't necessary.
that's going to wrap us up probably for this week. That was chapters 1 and 2 of The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. I don't even want to say like, comment, and subscribe, because I don't know.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Smash that like button!
Give us money on our Patreon, people! Ugh.
Oh, we have a Patreon.
Well, before we actually wrap up, we got a couple minutes before we all got to get kicked out. Let's go over like our basic overview of our impressions of the first couple chapters of The Conquest of Bread, what we thought it was going to be, what it ended up being, and so forth.
I honestly didn't go in there with expectations.
Nice.
Like, at all.
Well, okay, here's the one expectation that it blew me a little bit away with a few. It was like some modern concepts that I just took for granted as being a cultural phenomenon of the 20th century date back a couple more centuries. It's just like, well, a little bit exaggerated. You get the idea. It's just like, whoa, they were doing it.
That's what I found most interesting, is that a lot of the arguments he's arguing against are actually arguments that I've heard very, very often in this day and age, because we're returning to basically that same context of liberalism. That's what neoliberalism is we're going back to the old context of classical liberalism, except this time with more globalization. That's the new
fucking neoliberals.
Yeah. That's
my ContraPoints impression.
I will actually be honest, having had read Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution by Kropotkin before actually reading A Conquest of Bread, like, a lot of what he's talking about in these first couple chapters of The Conquest of Bread were expanded upon quite deftly in Mutual Aid, and I think the next book that we should read is Mutual Aid, just to kind of round out the Kropotkin theory.
Yeah, I was thinking either next book was going to be Mutual Aid or something by Bakunin, just because doing a different author and kind of taking his take on stuff in his different context. And then we'll go into maybe more modern stuff or maybe other pieces and talk also.
So when are we going to do some like really basic shit and, do the Communist Manifesto on this cast?
I don't think we need to do that.
Communist Manifesto, honestly, the issue with the Communist Manifesto is it's really not the best work to get into something like communism or socialism or like even especially anarchism. But
oh yeah, no, it's definitely anti-anarchist.
Yeah,
but it is pretty statey.
I will say that my impressions of this book, coming from Mutual Aid, like he seems a little more radical in The Conquest of Bread than he did in Mutual Aid. Like in Mutual Aid, it was kind of like it felt very, I want to say sterile, because in Mutual Aid he was coming at this from a very scientific standpoint. He basically wrote that book like a scientific article, whereas The Conquest of Bread, it feels it's a lot more impassioned.
This is more the book for the common man rather than for the scientist.
Yeah, it's presenting Kropotkin's ideals of what is based on Mutual Aid to the worker who doesn't really have the chance to sit there and study theory for decades at a time, or the 13-year-old who doesn't really understand much about what's going on in the world besides, I have to go to work to make sure that I'm still living.
Yeah, this is kind of, I believe on my other podcast we talked about in Sig Marxism, we were talking about the difference between working class people who have to go to work and then also kind of want to get into socialism, and then more of like there's a bit of an elitism within academia about socialism, because it's like, if you want to be a socialist, you have to read all the literature and you have to do all this stuff. And hopefully, especially like that's our goal with this pod, is we're trying to get this pod and bring it to the everyday people.
I mean, if that's the case for socialism, then it's going to be a real bitch to be a capitalist too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's like, you don't count as a capitalist if you haven't read all of the capitalist theory.
If you haven't read all of Atlas Shrugged, then you can't be a capitalist.
Well, and like you said, like that's what we're trying to do with this podcast. We're trying to take these very dense theory books and, make it more accessible to the average person. Because I'm going to be honest, like, even when I was reading Proudhon, like, years ago, like, it took me... I'm a fast reader. It took me months just to get through What is Property. Months. And that book is like 200-300 pages long.
Jesus.
Yeah, it is some dense stuff, and that's what a lot of this, even anarchist theory, like the highbrow stuff, it's very dense. So for us to sit down and bring it to a lot more common folk, I feel like it will make a lot of this theory a lot more accessible.
Just one final thing I wanted to touch on, the second part of the podcast. What does anarchism have to do with furries, and why do you think it is important to the furry community?
That's gonna be fun. I probably shouldn't get high next time.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Well, anyways, go everybody who's listening. You know, we might set up a Patreon. Who knows? We probably won't. Yeah, all two of us. Go ahead, and if you find us on, you know, whatever podcast site you're listening to, you know, give us a like. You know, share it with your friends. We might post this to. I think we just post it to anything, but
yeah,
you know.
I'm probably gonna post it to YouTube. We'll make a SoundCloud. We'll do maybe on iTunes. We'll see.
Like and subscribe and hit that bell. Fuck, I'm high. Oh, wow.